Hello, welcome back, everyone. I guess I shouldn't say back because I'm the person that's back. Everybody else was just doing business as usual. But yeah, today we have a few API review requests. Two of them are blocking. I think when I sent on the agenda yesterday, only one was blocking, but another one popped to the top, which is totally fine. So who wants to start on this one here?
I can bring everybody up to speed. If this is basically helping Roslyn know if a runtime implementation supports ref fields. That is it. There is a link. I think it's the first link. It is the PR that added support for this in the issue. That points to an Uber issue, which has a series of other steps that are being included. But this is the first step in indicating to Roslyn that it can say without question that we will respect ref fields and they can make their determinations appropriately based on this. So it's that it has no other purpose.
And we don't support this today, right? Span was this type where we hacked, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use by reference of T today, which is more or less a very unsafe ref field.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is so we wouldn't have this problem where we would like to see the support in an older runtime or something like this, right? So we can literally say it will only work on .NET 7 and up.
I mean, we do have the problem that people would like to see this in older runtimes, but we also have the problem that it's not going to happen.
Yeah, what I meant is like if the runtime would allow it and then the compiler just blocks it because the API isn't present, then I think the desire would be there, right? But if the runtime fundamentally can't do it, then I think it's fine to say, yeah, the compiler is agreeing with that assessment.
Right. And this is both like this is something that's new in the runtime. It requires us to change the ECMA spec. It's likely also going to be tied into a couple of other things that we're doing, like removing the notion of restricted types, which is very tied to ref fields. Like it's basically this one little linchpin that allows us to make a number of changes in the runtime. And this is kind of the key to the compiler that, okay, this runtime supports that level, that this runtime supports ref field, which has these other implications as well.
Makes sense.
So I have a slight meta question here. Over the past few releases, we've added a bunch of runtime feature flags to the runtime features class here. And up until now, we've largely been the only runtime that's had to implement them. But as other people in the industry, such as Unity, are looking to start supporting .NET 6 and higher, it would be very easy for them to miss things like these APIs are meaningful in the sense that, hey, we actually have to add runtime support for by-ref fields, or hey, span actually has to be implemented using an interior pointer for it to work correctly on these runtimes. Because otherwise APIs like memory marshal create span are no longer safe. So the question kind of is, how are we going to ensure that adding these fields are going to be visible to those runtimes, and that they're going to implement them correctly? Other libraries have basic conformance tests for some of these things. So is that something that we should consider as a follow-up question to ensure that it's working and figured out for them, and that our partners like Unity are very well aware of the requirements here?
I mean, the thinking in the past was that this would basically be modeled with .NET Standard, right? And that's where we would have the discussion whether it's a requirement that everybody has. Now that we no longer have .NET Standard, the idea was effectively that anybody who would build a new runtime would effectively fork what we have and then add their stuff on top, which means they would get everything that's already there. I think that doesn't quite fly for the runtime because, as you pointed out, there are alternative implementations of the runtime that are not just simple forks of what we have. So just because we have support for it doesn't mean other people have support for it. So we should probably think about a way to model that. I mean, practically speaking, I think we could just start a conversation with them. I mean, there's this larger problem though if regardless of how we model this in terms of APIs and stuff, there's this larger problem that we just don't have a TFM for this anymore, right? So the only TFM that we currently have that is basically the shared one is net 6, net 7, net 8, net 9. So if we will have a situation where a runtime can't support all the APIs, we are kind of screwed no matter what, because we can't add the field here for ourselves and then not have somebody else expose it because it's one and the same representation. So it's not just about the APIs at that point. It just also becomes how do you target the thing that works, on, let's say, in Unity, right? So that's I think a larger problem.
I think that's fine. I think it's completely fine to say .NET 7 requires BiRef field support in the runtime. I don't think that's problematic. I think the problem is ensuring that the alternative runtimes are aware that it's a requirement, because if you're not aware of the runtime features class, if you're not that integrated into API review and stuff, this is kind of a niche thing in a niche namespace that you're never going to look at, and it might just appear to be an API that was added, and you're never even going to think or consider it. And so the question is really, how do we tell users that implementing BiRef fields is required if you want to say you're .NET 7 compatible, and it requires this specific features to be effectively spec compliant.
But in the case of Unity, I just resolved the bug that they filed to say please add ref fields to the language and runtime.
Well, I think that's might be a different situation, but I think the meta question that Tanner is asking, right? If we just add stuff to that, then how would they know?
I know. He is using Unity as an example, and Unity filed the bugs to do this originally. So hopefully they're.
I think this is a good conversation to have offline. I mean, the number of people that implement a custom runtime can be counted on like less than the number of fingers on my hand. We can have conversations with all of them if and when it becomes an issue. There's also even if we miss things, we're taking advantage of these features all over the place. The rest of the API surface area simply won't work if those features aren't available. So I understand the concern. I think there's validity to it. There's probably documentation to be done or whatever, but I don't think we need to rat hole on it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to follow up offline. Looks good to me. Ship it.
All right, so this is. Let me actually zoom in here for like 5 times. So we cool with that, right? Everybody agrees with that? Going, gone. All right, next one.
So I marked this as blocking because Fred had IM'd me to say, hey, can you make sure this shows up at the next review? But that was this morning. I'm not sure he realized the next review was like a couple hours later. So he's not online right now.
Jared, can you talk to this or no?
No, let me hold on. Oh, and no, he is not in the office, so I can't make him get online real quick. So we should probably just punt it to the next one.
That works. Blocked by author. All right, Stephen, I think you're up again.
So this is a pretty simple API or set of APIs. Basically, we've got APIs on Regex that allow you to see whether something's a match, to perform a match and kind of get back a match object that represents what matched. We also have a matches method that gives you back a collection of all the matches and materializes sort of all of them. And then we have some additional helpers, replace, which is sort of sits on top of those logically and finds all the matches and then replaces it based on a delegate you provide or some other input you provide, and a split, which is basically string split, but based on what the regex matched. The proposal here is to add another helper that's basically count. And you see this show up in a variety of places where people write a loop that looks very much like what's on the screen right now, just to find out how many things matched in the input. Sometimes this shows up in benchmarking. Sometimes this shows up in just, how many matches did I have in my document? How many times did whatever word occur? And part of it is, you have to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many lines. Part of it is there's no way to do it as efficiently as possible because all the mechanisms that we expose require basically creating multiple objects per match. Every match object is itself an object plus under the covers, there's multiple arrays that get created to represent captures and various kinds of state. And if we were to implement it ourselves, we can avoid all of that overhead. So the suggestion here is to add a set of count overloads to make this operation simple and straightforward.
So I just looked at matches. So matches also has an overload that given a string and an offset, you can do that. And I guess your intention is if you care about this, you have to use the span-based overload. That's my intention, yeah. So Jose is currently, as we speak, working on the span support. If you scroll down just a little bit to the actual API proposal, there are sort of two buckets of APIs here. There's one that takes string and there's one that takes span. And my suggestion is that we rely on the span-based one if you actually want a substring of the input. There's a separate issue for other APIs based on span. So we could approve, or we could discuss just the ones on string, or we can conditionally approve the ones based on span, or however you want to do it. Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument and say, what about languages that don't support span? But usually our argument is, if there is a way to do it, and if it's just less performant, that's usually fine. Which is basically what the string overload would provide, right? You just call substring yourself, and then yes, you allocate, but that's just the way it is. And if there's really demand for it, we can of course always add it later. Right.
Do we really need this as 3 methods instead of 2 with default parameters?
We could do that. I opted to kind of match the pattern that's employed for regex and split and matches and match. I figured at this point, why diverge? But we could. There's a small subtle difference when it comes to time span, which is to the match timeout, which is today there's a distinction made between not passing a timeout and between passing a default timeout, a default or an infinite timeout. Basically, if you specify a timeout, it will always use what you specified, even if it's infinite. If you don't specify one, then there's this like process-wide app context setting that allows someone to override and basically enforce a timeout on all regexes. And that only applies if you don't specify a timeout. So making that optional would, unless we also made it nullable, would potentially have some behavioral differences from the other APIs, because we would not be able to detect the difference between supplying a default infinite timeout and not supplying one at all.
So you're saying that it was by design that if you pass an infinite, we go down the path of, okay, there is a timeout that's being checked, even if that is infinite.
The code very clearly does that. Whether that was the developer's intent or not, I can't speak to what they were thinking.
I mean, that seems kind of weird because, I mean, at that point you can ask what the app domain configuration is, right? And if there is one specified, then you honor it. And if there's not, you just go down the unrestrained code path, right?
Yeah, I imagine it was the way of basically saying, I'm totally speculating here, but I imagine the thought was, well, if the developer didn't think to provide one, then let's allow an admin or someone to override it. But if they did think to provide it, then they get the final say. I'm totally speculating.
I see.
Perhaps the only overload that you could argue that could be defaulted was the one that only takes in options, not the time span, right?
Sure.
But then, as you said, like it's just for consistency. All of our APIs have the one that doesn't have options, the one that has options, and the one that has options and time span.
Yeah.
Timeout. So
the other option to consider is don't have any of the static methods at all. The static methods are sort of a nice convenience. You want to do something very simple. They are a performance trap because they have to there's a lot of work that gets done when you construct a regex from a pattern, and under the covers, that's what this is doing. And so there's a cache, but it's a fixed size cache. And if you were to, do a lot of this, you would probably end up doing a whole bunch of throwaway work. But again, I followed the pattern that we have for match and matches and split and replace, which is basically these 4 overloads essentially for each of them.
And is match, yeah.
Yeah, and is match, yeah.
So if the static counts are a performance trap because basically it's doing new regex inside itself, then let's move the new to color code so they can see to save it. So just kill the statics.
Yeah, I'm kind of in support of not doing that, but I guess my rationale would be if we keep the pattern, it would be fairly trivial to have an analyzer that detects the trivial thing where you do something like matches and then dot length or dot count and then replaces that with a call to count. That's a lot harder to do if, the whole invocation changes to, new upper regex and then do the thing.
The problem I like, the only comment or argument that I have with that is that it's going to be a discoverability problem because a lot of people call this statics. Like if you look at the code out there, most people use regex.match as opposed to like creating an instance. Whether or not that's the right thing to do, like that's a different thing, but it's just about discoverability. I think that if we hide it as an instance method only, a lot of people are going to miss this.
And it can be argued either way. I mean, to Jose's point, like not everyone cares about, regex at scale. If you just want to very quickly figure out how many things are, in an input, there's no problem with regex.count with the static. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess
I err on the side of just going with what we already have.
Yeah, I was about to say that I like just the, not reinventing the pattern, I guess, and just sticking to it, even if it means we have 4 methods now. That seems fine.
Also talking about precedents, I don't think that we've ever done, or Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've ever done like adding an instance method like this, but not the statics in regex.
No.
So this would be like the one time.
Then again, I think all of the methods on regex have been there since 2000 or whenever it was first created. So I'm not sure we've ever added anything to regex. That's not true. I think we added the timeouts maybe a decade ago.
It's a security thing.
Okay. I think I was on the team when we did timeouts, so it might still be ancient, but it was recent ancient. All right, are we then just saying we take it as is?
I think from my perspective, that's fine. I'm also fine saying, we can go ahead and implement the string-based ones, and then we could, add the span-based ones at the same time as we add the other span-based stuff, and potentially re-review them or tweak them to match whatever pattern is approved there. There's a separate issue for providing span-based support that Jose is currently working on finalizing the details for to go from API suggestion to API ready for review.
Sounds good. All right, then that's the one we do, and then we can.
So I had put in chat a question as to whether this would encourage people to call count instead of isMatch, just because we know from experience that devs look for APIs called length, count, and so on. And I'm wondering if that does potentially open the pit of failure as far as performance goes.
You're worried people are going to do count
instead of isMatch
not equal 0?
Yes, because like count is a common API name that I would just expect to be, on a collection thing. Ismatch, unless I actually read the regex documentation, I won't even know that it's there.
I mean, you have to provide input. Like none of these are parameterless. Mm-hmm. None of them are properties.
Yeah.
So I feel like if you don't realize that it's going to be doing, at least order n work, that's on you. But
well, we talked previously about having an analyzer that looks for places that you could have called as empty or anything like that. This would just be similar. Of we could do a thing and ask, are you calling regex count greater than 0? Okay, call regex as match instead.
Right.
Sure.
Like it's an easy analyzer.
Yeah, and maybe that's not something that needs to take place right now. I just kind of wanted to put the seed in your minds to say, hey, do we need to do something in the future to make this better for people?
I think it's a reasonable question, and I think Jeremy's suggestion and your Levi's suggestion of punting till later is a reasonable answer. There is a very simple analyzer we can write and basically say if you are comparing it to 0, there is a better option. I suspect we're not going to find that it's a problem, but famous last words.
Yeah, I mean, given that Ismatch
Oh
is
yeah,
also
and
ancient,
I'd always be happy.
Like Ismatch is probably one of the highest used APIs, and again, as Stephen said, like this is a 20-year-old API, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to break into jail, certainly. Like, if it's not a problem, great, no action required. But if our goal is to try to get new people into the ecosystem and they learn about patterns like length and count because they're common, they're probably going to see those over Ismatch.
That's fair. I applaud thinking about analyzers as part of new APIs, so yay. But I think this is one we should.
I feel that. Yeah, I feel validated. Hooray.
Just a question about the analyzer. I mean, like you said that the analyzer will just compare to 0 and flag that. I mean,
well, the concern was if someone should have been calling regex.isMatch input and was instead doing regex.count input does not equal 0 as a way to see whether there was a match. But those are functionally.
I would say like if somebody is not trying to do the match and trying to just get the count and comparing against 0 is valid. I mean, like it's not bad.
No, it's if they write if basically it's just the test condition. If regex.count greater than 0, or if regex.count equals 0.
If someone was doing that, it would be a lot more efficient to just do regex.isMatch.
If they saved the integer and then they used it later, then they wanted the count, and now they're actually saving on work instead of asking the question twice. But if they're using, tell me the absolute number, all that I care is if it's 0 or not, then that's inefficient because you have to find the second match to find if there was a second match, instead of aborting at the first one and saying true.
We have a similar analyzer already for compare and string.equals. Like we recommend if you're using compare, but you're just comparing the result against 0, then we suggest you switch to equals instead. And the gap between those is actually a lot less than the gap between isMatch and count here.
right?
I think we have a similar one for contains and index of. Right? If you're just doing index of does not equal -1, we recommend you switch to contains. So this is a similar vein. And I noticed Fred joined. You want to go back?
Of course, no, that's the one I closed.
Control-Shift-T.
Yeah, I don't dare doing this on a live call. God knows what tab opens when I do that.
Hey everyone. Sorry, when I asked Steve to tag my things for review, I didn't expect it would be 10 a.m. the next morning.
We're fast. What can I say?
We're efficient here, Fred.
Yeah.
When did that start?
All right.
Just speaks to how seriously we take you.
Yes. This is scary, but great. Okay. So for C#11, we are looking at a feature called required members. What required members is, to give you a little bit of background, is basically when today there's a big problem with lots of data model classes, things that where people expect you to use an object initializer to set some properties or expect the BCL through EF core or some other deserialization mechanism to set these properties. And they have their string name that's never going to be null, and then they nullable enable, and it goes, hey, you need to have a constructor that sets string to a not null thing. And the typical workaround for this case is equal null bang or equal default bang. And then there are other properties that maybe they're not reference types that you want people to be able to, that you want to require that people set. And those you just can't do anything about it. So in C# 11, we are adding a feature called required members, which if you look at that class C in the middle here, you can say public required int property get in it. And then that says if you are calling the constructor for this type, then you must set property in an object initializer. And that tells nullable that, hey, if this property is non-null, that's going to be taken care of by the consumer, and generally lets you try and do this more declarative style of syntax. Yeah. So to support that, we need two APIs. One of them I put in system runtime compiler services because we don't expect people to use it, and in fact, manually, and in fact, it will be an error if someone types it up by hand, and that's the required member attribute. What's going to happen is the required member attribute is going to go on a type, so it's going to go on C here, and that tells the compiler, hey, this thing has required members in it, and then it will go in the property, on the property itself. To tell the compiler this property is required, or fields, because you can require fields. So that one, these are both basically empty attributes for the moment, and the one in compiler services, we don't expect, they're not for manual usage. Then there is the no required members attribute, which I put in the same namespace as all of our nullable attributes in the system diagnostics code analysis namespace. And what that one is it, say for example, you have a copy constructor that copies all the properties from some old instance to a new instance, like for example, any record constructor, any record copy constructor. Well, those take care of setting all the required members, right? There's nothing else to do. And so you can put this attribute on a specific constructor, and then that tells the compiler, hey, when this constructor is called, don't bother checking for required members. They're taken care of by the constructor. So you don't need to require people use an object initializer with that. And again, there's no arguments to this thing. It's just we in the future we may consider expansions to this feature to allow individual tweaking. So like saying that, oh, this constructor sets this property, but not this property, and like allowing you to tweak things. But for the moment, it's either all or nothing. And yeah, that's the proposal. These names, by the way, are what I came up with. I'm not known for my name smithing, so feel free to suggest new ones.
Yeah, I mean, the two immediate pieces of feedback that I have is no required members is wrong. It's it would be satisfies required members. And then that instead of doing the all or nothing, you should just, like, I think that this should just start with name all the fields. So like we have for nullability, we have this member will make this field be populated. Just trust me. I think it should just be satisfies required member name of property.
No, we do not want to do that. The reason we do not want to do that is because it is a goal with this feature to not duplicate information. We already have a way of duplicating information across a class hierarchy. Those are constructor parameters. If you want to customize that more, use constructor parameters. The goal here is if I have let's say I have a class hierarchy that's split up across a couple of DLLs, and property constructor A is copy constructor A is calling into copy constructor B. If B adds a new property, then they need to update their copy constructor, and A should be fine. A shouldn't have to list any new information. It shouldn't have to be recompiled. Nothing. So
sure,
specifically not a goal.
Because I guess you may not want to look at how it cascades, but yeah, I mean, it's just if you look at things that exist in reality instead of in academia, you end up with we had this constructor that took 2 things, and then we had these settable properties, and then we added this constructor that takes 4 things, and then we added a default constructor to let more object initializer scenarios work. And I don't think that you end up with this pure, like, this is just a copy constructor and does things. You end up with, like, reality. and that the only way that you can describe reality is field at a time.
Those classes, Jeremy, are not in scope for this feature. If you want to have customize what properties this constructor takes or not, slap a no required members attribute on it and take parameters.
But in that case, you have to take all the parameters.
Yes, it does mean you have to take all the parameters. And my initial proposal in required members had a whole meta language that with special syntax for customizing things in and out, and we stepped away from that because we don't think that is in scope for an initial version of this feature.
So earlier you said you may want to do the subsetting though, right? What would that look like in terms of attributes?
In terms of attributes, we would probably add something new. So it would depend on one of two things. We would probably add the inclusive and the exclusive versions of an attribute. It does require, or like put a no required members on it, and then a does require X, does require Y. And we would probably also let you do the other way around, saying just exclude this one. To require everything except this one property or something like that.
I see.
Whether we would do that as an attribute that you would manually put on, or whether we would come up with some sort of syntax, that's a separate question.
Is the no required members scenario really just for records? Like how often do people do copy constructors in the real world?
Honestly, I don't see it being a huge thing. I see most of this type of I don't really see people adopting this half sale in their types. I see them.
But I mean, when would they ever even? When would you actually do their no required members? Like
if you're trying to do something
records.
special.
I guess the concern is you say if you're trying to do something special, but we've just said that the most common special things that we've seen are off the table. So it's curious that we're saying if you're trying to do something special, but we've already dismissed some of those special things.
Well, it wouldn't be off the table, right? It would just be you take those as parameters, right? So if certain things are required, you basically say now you do the old school. You tell us what you require as parameters.
Right, but then that prohibits you from having overloads that, as we've done in the past, overloads that it takes parameter A and also an overload that takes parameter A and parameter B. You can't do that. You can only have the one that takes everything.
Everything that's required.
I mean,
if B was optional, it would be
fair.
fine.
I'm just not seeing the no required members scenario. So that's why I'm asking the question is like how common is this? Do we really think we need no required members?
Well, I mean, yes, we need to, at the very least, we need something for records. Like the bare minimum, we need something for records. But I do think that having the ability to say, yeah, no, this constructor is doing something interesting. I will manually specify my parameters is a useful feature.
It seems like it's just the escape hatch, right? You basically say this type has some required fields, and then you want a way to say, if you call this constructor, ignore all required properties or fields, which seems reasonable, right? That's the typical way we do things, where we say, here's a restriction, and then there's a way to turn off the restriction if you really need to.
But to Jeremy's point, that's not what we did with nullable. Like nullable said, here's a restriction, and then you turn it off on a field-by-field basis with member not null.
Yeah, the problem is, how would you do this with this feature, though?
Satisfies required member name of property.
Right, but that's extremely ugly.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fair. If we think that basically all constructors, that if we want to say that a constructor that's not a default constructor, almost by definition is accepting all required things, and you effectively can't add a required thing later, that's a massive compatibility breaking change, then yes, basically it's this constructor promises no object initializer is required, and that's a reasonable start. But I still think no should turn into satisfies all.
Satisfies all is fine with me.
Because no required members reads to me Englishy like, oh, they're constructor parameters, but like, ignore them. They're not. None of them are required.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Again, I came up with some words in 10 seconds and put them on a page, knowing that no matter what I put there, you would change them anyway.
Do we really think that in the future, if we did the more fine-grained thing, it would require a new attribute? If you, instead of saying satisfies all required members, it just said satisfies required members, and it was, there's a parameterless constructor today, and we were to add a constructor in the future that accepted a param string array that allows you to list which ones it satisfies. Is that how we would expose it, or you think there's no way we could do it with the same attribute?
I think that would be reasonable. I do wonder whether we'd need an inverse as well, an ability to put satisfies required members with no parameterless and then requires member X on it. But I don't. That is fine with me.
Remind me again.
I'm okay with your proposal, Steve.
Fred, remind me, in the constructor of a custom attribute, name of cannot see properties of the type, right?
Name of can see properties of the type.
It can?
It can't see parameters, although I think we're trying to fix that for C# 10.11.
I see. So then it wouldn't be like super ugly. You could actually say name of blah, name of blah, name of blah.
Name of blah. You could do that, yes.
Yeah, you can definitely do name of a property because we do it all the time in our tests.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine that there's different properties, right? You could have requires and does not require, or not requires, right? Rather than
and to be clear, my initial proposal had a whole meta language for doing this, and we looked at it from C# and we went,
nah,
this is too much for V1.
So
yeah, I can see that.
I like the extensibility of Steve's suggestion of not include the word all that I put and then extending the attribute type. The only thing that I question on that is it going to be complicated for users with versions of compilers and tooling, right? Because I mean, we could certainly say that Roslyn in the first version looks for satisfies required members default attribute constructor, and if you happen to call one that has a shape to it, then it says I don't know what this means, and then when we add support later, then it's like, oh, now I know what this means. But otherwise you end up with this, I wanted to say I only support these three things, but I hit an older version of a compiler and now it thinks everything is satisfied.
Yeah, so what would happen likely, and I will say if this is the road we want to go with, I will add a test to make sure that this is what actually works, is that if it sees an unrecognized shape for that, it should fail, and then just say I don't understand this constructor, I can't help you. And then the other thing that I need to talk with the F# folks to come up with a design that helps, that works for both. But we are talking about having basically a poison attribute that's not a mod rec that you can slap on something to say you need to understand this feature string in order to use this language, to use this
mod rec, but without using that feature.
Mod rec without using that feature for scenarios A, like ref-like types where you can't put a mod rec there, and B, cases where we don't want to break binary compatibility, which is which is why we want it here. Because if you, let's say for example, you have a type that has required members, and you remove all of them, you say none of the members are required anymore. Well, if we were mod recking the constructor, you've just broken binary compat by removing your required members. So we would need some type of attribute to put on the constructor to say, no, I had required members at one point, emit that mod rec even though I don't have required members anymore. And that's yeah.
Why
Steve
don't
had
we
another...
just say removing required is a break and change? Like, why don't we just accept that removing required is a break and change?
Because the goal of it was to not have it be a binary break and change.
I mean,
well, is adding a required member a break and change? It's a source
not a
break and
binary
change,
break
but
and
it's not a binary break and change.
That is correct. But
So
we
would we consider adding a required member breaking change?
I would consider
Would be
it
from the purposes
adding,
of the API team.
Yes, I would consider it an API breaking change. I would not consider it a binary breaking change. Now, to give you some background, and Levi, I think you were in these discussions. We tried for some time to figure out an encoding that would allow adding or remove, that would make adding a new required member a binary breaking change, but would make removing a binary member, removing a member not a binary breaking change. And we did some tried to do some very interesting things with generic constraints and variance, and trying to basically create an equation around satisfying variance around what members are required and what members are not. We went down that road pretty far, and we weren't really able to come up with something that we thought would be usable. And so we decided to accept that yes, this is an API breaking change that is not reflected as a binary breaking change. And while that's unfortunate, it is what it is.
We have the
So
package
I wonder if
validation
that's
though.
something. Yeah, that's something that we should update ourselves in our what is a breaking change document. Emo, Jeremy, I don't know who owns that document, but adding a required property should be considered for us a breaking change.
Absolutely, it takes something from compiling to not compiling. That's a breaking change.
Yeah, I mean, it already satisfies the definitions that we have, right? Because we do separate out source breaking from binary breaking. And I mean, the obvious example would be nullability, where we said, yes, we are willing to change them based on feedback, even though that's a source breaking change. I could see being required in the same category, right? Because we may have situations where we use this feature, and then later on we discover, hey, there are code paths that basically always throw an exception when this thing is not initialized, and the old constructors or the old scenarios that we designed this for are no longer applicable or obsolete or whatever, right? And then we want to make it required. So I mean, I could see cases where we would want to do that, but I think by and large, I think we are not super likely to run into this, right? I think for the most part, when we design types, we know what's required.
Okay. Yeah, this would just be for weird things like and not that we would change them at this point, but the event log class, which had it only has a default constructor, and you're supposed to assign like 6 things in the property grid because it was .NET Framework 1, and then now, huzzah, you can read an event log, and otherwise you get weird, you haven't set this yet exceptions. So, but I think we stopped designing types like that after .NET Framework 1.0.
Yeah, dragging and dropping random types from the design surface, I think, is an idea that we buried in the past. All right, so then I'll be happy with what I have on screen right now.
I had 2 questions. One is just another naming question. Is there are other words we could choose instead of satisfies? We could do sets, which is more of C# setting things. Tarek also suggested fulfill. And then my second question is more technical. The default for attribute usage is allow multiple false inherited true.
I saw your comment this morning, and I hadn't, and then I forgot about it, and because I meant to respond to it, but we're already in the meeting. Inherited should probably be false. It's going to put one of these on every type. The compiler will manually put this on a type. And so if you inherit from something that has required members and you don't add any new required members, we don't want the attribute there, because we will be manually checking the base list basically as we go through to see which things are required and which things are not. And the required member attribute basically serves as a marker to tell the compiler, bother loading and figuring out what all the properties and members of this type and see whether or not any of them are required, versus don't bother doing work. So it should be inherited false. Allow duplicates also false. Allow multiple.
So regarding the first one, the naming one, I actually like sets required members. Anybody objects to that? It's short.
The only question I would have on that one is, does sets imply non-null? Like, you could have a required nullable reference type that you're allowed to set null, but if we said sets required members, would that imply to a human that this thing is guaranteed not null.
I don't think so.
If no humans here believe that it would imply that, then I'm fine with sets.
A definite problem we've had in this proposal with talking with people about it is this conflation of null versus required. So I can definitely understand that concern. A lot of people come to the issue and say, hey, why don't you just make all non-nullable things required? It's like, well, that's A, you're changing your public API, and B, what if you want to require a nullable thing? There's a lot. What if you want to require something like a value type? You know, there's a lot of conflation here, and there are cases where it could be perfectly valid. You want to make sure that someone is thinking about it, but you know, null is a valid thing to think about.
So basically, the language semantics are if something is a nullable reference type or nullable value type and it's required, it just means you have to explicitly assign it, but you can assign it null and it's fine.
Correct.
In that case, I think sets is fine. I mean, like that literally just specifies the mechanics. You set it to something.
Yep, that's fine.
The only thing
One more question I have.
Sorry, the only thing with that design is basically it would be harder to do the subtract from this, right? Like this basically says like the best you can do here is now specify the members you actually set, but you can't really specify the unset members in the same attribute.
I mean, you could sets required members with the default or with the default constructor, and then you have needs required members or missed required members or something.
Or
we could come up with we can come up with words that satisfy it. I don't think there would be a scenario for mixing the expanded param string version with the except, so it would just be everything except or explicit or everything.
I guess you could have an except property, right, which basically would read fairly intuitively, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. The annoying thing on that one is you can't params a property, so you'd have to say except, and then if that took a string array, I don't think you can describe that in the array language or in the attribute language.
No, you can. I think you can say new brackets and then party on it.
Okay.
That works fine.
All right, I guess that's some weird things are allowed that aren't constish. So we could do it as an except that takes a string array later.
All right.
One more question I have is how does this play with serialization at all? Deserialization in particular? Do we expect that? Because if we're putting it in the runtime compiler services namespace, like do we expect deserializers to be able to look at this attribute?
I certainly hope so.
Well, I think it feels weird a little weird if the serializer is reading something out of compiler services, since that's usually the language and the compiler talking to each other instead of the runtime and the developer talking to each other.
The way I think of compiler services, maybe that's wrong. To me, that's just type system encodings, right? And so it's similar to nullable attributes, right? If you really want to understand nullable, well, it is in compiler services too, right? Which is, you don't parse those attributes yourself because that would be insane. So we have APIs to do that, but there are other things in that namespace that you can query for today, like default member attribute and stuff like that serializer could potentially read. I'm not sure what you want the serializer to do though. Like, would you expect it to throw when not everything is initialized?
You bomb for sure. You bomb when all the required members aren't there.
Yeah, and to be clear, one of the nice things about this version of the proposal, another version had just a single attribute with strings listed at the type level. The nice thing about this one is a serializer can just look at all the properties and ask and just if we don't add a new property info or field info field for is required, they can just look at the attribute of that member and say, is this attribute there? Was it not present? Cool. Throw.
But my question is,
certain serializers
putting it in compiler services, like, is that the right place? Like, you started this conversation with nobody should use this attribute, so that's why
nobody should. At least the way that I think of system runtime compiler services is that these are the attributes that users should not be, the users generally, with very minor exceptions, should not be manually using things from there. That's not to say they shouldn't be looking for things from there. That's the way I think about it.
I mean, quite
There's
frankly,
a difference between applying it and looking for it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, to me, even if a serializer would parse those attributes, I think at that point it's fair to say you play in the type system game, so you're exposed to the more raw ugliness here. But we can also just expose the reflection API similar to what we have done for nullability, right? I mean, especially when we, if we actually add, accept rules in the, later, I think at that point we probably want an API that encapsulates those because people will not get it right.
And I think that at least the initial version just add very easy to add a field info or property info property for this thing is required because it just needs to check an attribute.
Yeah, this one wouldn't be fairly straightforward because it's not part of generics and other fun parts.
Yep.
But I think it's a fair question. I think once we have this feature, we probably want to touch the serializers we care about to do something.
Well, I mean, like that sounds nice, but so I guess here's a thing that's related to this feature. Like if the JSON serialization wants to add mandatory member support, I'll use a different word just so it doesn't collide with this. They're net standard 2. Every feature they've ever added has gone back to net standard 2. If this is defined as net, whatever the next version we're on now is, 7, I think. If this is net 7, they can't use it. So now they're still going to have their own system. They're never going to unify on this because they already have their own way of doing it. So unless we push these attributes as being defined and or being referenceable by a net standard assembly, it's useless to JSON.
I mean, they can still use it. I mean, like it depends what your definition of use is. I mean, the serializer itself can't mark its own, APIs as required potentially if it wants to target net standard, but nothing really prevents the reflection code we have in the serializer to look for this attribute and do something useful with it, right? Because that, you can of course do that in net standard too.
Well, but Fred said that the next version of Roslyn is going to fail to compile if you've manually specified one of these attributes. So if you're building a net standard 2.0 library with a data type.
No, I mean, so I think there's a difference between our stuff and then what customers do, right? Like if a customer is targeting net standard 2, yeah, they can't use it. But if our library is a net standard 2.0 library and somebody uses it from .NET 7, they can mark their own things as required, and then we can.
Right, but I don't. The question is, would the JSON team feel that they've satisfied the customer demand for mandatory properties through deserialization if it only works in net 7, given that the rest of their library is net standard 2?
Yeah, I think that's a separate question. I mean, to me, it's almost kind of like the reality of physics, right? If somebody asks for a new feature, our general answer is it's on the new platform only, right? Especially when it's language features. We don't do language features usually with travel back in time capabilities, right? We do it sometimes if we can, but the general expectation is that you should assume we don't. And I think that would be another. But I mean, realistically, there's nothing really preventing the compiler to say if these things resolve, the feature works. So if somebody wants to do it,
it will do exactly that.
Then you just copy paste the attribute definition in your code, mark them all as internal, and stuff will just fly, right? I mean that's kind of
just like every new language feature that has an attribute for it, right? We don't validate that this thing actually comes from system runtime compiler services or from the same assembly that defines system.object, right? It's like if we find this attribute, we find this attribute. Cool.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. I think then we discussed this to death. I think then this one we already did. Up down counter now, I think.
All right.
Yeah.
See you, folks.
Thanks.
Okay. Up down counter. So if you remember, we have exposed metrics APIs in .NET 6, and mainly the APIs is containing like a class called meter, and from the meter you can create instruments. Instruments is what the library or the application will use to publish the metrics measurements. In .NET 6, we exposed 4 instruments. Counter, histogram, and observable counter and observable gauge. During .NET 6, the specs was talking also about up-down counter, but we decided not to hurry to expose that during .NET 6 because there was some discussions around it in the OpenTelemetry community, and also we wanted to see, to get more feedback about this instrument before exposing it. So after we released, we have been a while now, and we got some good feedback. There is a demand on this instrument, up-down counter. So the difference between counter and up-down counter, counter is always incremental. Always take positive values, but up-down counter can take positive and negative. So one of the example of the scenarios, like somebody want to publish the queue size. The queue can grow and can shrink. So they can just send a delta, either positive value or negative value. So the proposal here is just expose this instrument. Up-down counter is the APIs is almost similar to the counter itself. The original counter that we exposed. It's exactly matching the same method signatures and same way that we support the counters. So the proposal here is we have this up-down counter of T, and T also it's like any other instruments we expose, it supports the numeric types. And also we have observable up-down counter. This is what we call the poll mode. The regular counter, the regular instrument usually is push mode. The library can push the value as long as it's available. Observable count, up-down counter, it will be poll mode. Whoever listening to the measurement need, intentionally can call the counter to get the values. So that's all. This is exactly matching the similar APIs that we exposed for the counter. Any questions?
I think I have to look at the API usage.
Is generic math supposed to ship in .NET 7?
Unless Tenor screws up, yeah.
Would this not be an ideal candidate for that, rather than restricting it to a specific set of T?
Maybe.
You're expecting it to be restricted to I addable or I incrementable, or just I number in general?
It looks like I addable if I'm seeing the API correctly.
The only thing here will be different from the counter that we expose in .NET 6. It will look, I don't know, if it would make a big difference here or not. So people will see counter restricted with the generic, and here will be different. But at the end, the result should be the same.
I think there's a lot of cases in the BCL where there's kind of two scenarios. There's one, the 20 years of existing APIs, which are generic and which we cannot modify to have the right constraint. And I don't think we are able to handle those without some feature in the language that basically supports shimming constraints. And then the other bit is that there's new APIs like this one, which could theoretically benefit from taking something like incrementable to indicate that you can, move to a next value, which is generally value +1.
But what does the math happen anyway here? I just don't see where the how do you subtract? I guess is my question. It seems like you just pass in values, right?
I think the logic is that the T can go up and down.
Right.
And so therefore you would want to be able to say T can only be something that has a contract that says it can go up and down.
Yeah, but I mean, if I mean, what does the library do? Does it just send the data over the wire? Like, what is the actual meaning if you pass in, let's say, a customer? Like, is there anything wrong going on somewhere? I guess it would be the server who tries to take that information and put a chart on it, right? Because at that point, you're no longer able to do anything useful with, you know, a JSON struct that represents a customer.
Yeah, I mean, these basically have to get two stringed to go over the wire. Though I guess the receiver receives it as a strong T.
Yeah, that's kind of what like my point is, if we constrain it to, let's say, I number, and then there's some other number that is not an int, a float, or a double, does the server know what to do, or is it in practice like it better be an int or a double or a float anyways, because that's how the telemetry backends work? Like, would it even buy us anything if we could constrain it?
Yeah, open telemetry specification is strict about that, almost the types that we're restricting for this type. So if we got anything outside the set, I don't think this is going to work.
Did you list the type somewhere?
Yeah, here under the API proposal.
Ah, here. Okay.
Yeah, if we're saying that, you know, we're trying to be, you know, consistent with that specification, then yeah, this would make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Why?
Thanks for humoring me.
Just quick question. Why? And I think maybe I asked this last time the proposal or a similar one came by. Why aren't the unsigned types there and SByte?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Yeah, for this one. Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know exactly. I mean, like, I just used whatever the counter had before. But we are really not restricting like the values while people calling the API. I mean, like, no, in counter, if somebody wrongly, I mean, call it with negative number, we don't do anything. We just like pass it. We don't do any validation. So it will be up to the caller to decide about like what types you need to use and how they are going to use it.
Right. I understood that. That's why I was asking why the unsigned types weren't there. Because there may be, for example, some user that needs a ulong counter, or some user that wants to have a 32-bit counter that's guaranteed non-negative.
Yeah, like what Tarek earlier said sounded like the types that are listed here were taken straight from the OpenTelemetry spec. So,
Right. Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
I mean, if the OpenTelemetry spec doesn't allow for that, then that
Right.
would be a reasonable
Yeah.
answer, right? But if it does, then we probably should allow it here as well.
The OpenTelemetry spec probably should allow it anyways, and I would guess that it was just missing because of CLS compliance or some other weird thing, because most other languages don't necessarily use or think of things in terms of signed types like we do. So if OpenTelemetry is meant to be, you know, a portable spec across languages, Rust, which frequently uses unsigned types, is going to likely be using unsigned types here, not signed ones.
Riley, do you remember anything from?
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, the OpenTelemetry spec is not picking on specific type. So basically, it's trying to be very language neutral. Like in Python, you can have arbitrary size integer that goes beyond even 64 bits. But I think for .NET, like we pick the signed one because we don't want to have both and run into the issue where people have to convert that and they have precision issue. So imagine like if you have some library that are using both signed and unsigned, and in your application things got mixed up, and you're exporting the data to Prometheus, and you need to aggregate the data. If you have an like overflow, what do? So we don't feel there's a good answer for that. And so this is why we decided to have a smaller scope.
This is basically forcing users to have to deal with overflow, though, because if they have an unsigned type, they have to explicitly convert it here to a signed type and deal with those issues anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there, I don't think there's any real benefit other than potentially forcing the users to go through a step rather than allowing them to consistently use a type everywhere.
So most of the metrics systems, they support negative number, and they like for things that can overflow, negative number is actually a good indication of overflow. So imagine if you have a counter that goes beyond a certain limit, then you see a round trip to a -1. Then from the metrics backend, normally the system will be smart enough to tell this is an overflow. But if you want to tell what's the exact overflow, like if you overflow that once, or you actually like run like 2 overflows in a single report cycle, you don't have that visibility, because that's the indication that instrumentation is done in a wrong way. Like you might change the magnitude of how you report the numbers.
Right.
This is the best effort. It's not a strict like math.
Right. I understand why negative numbers are good and why .NET, for example, decided 20 years ago to use sign types for things like length. But that what I'm trying to get at is that's different from how many actual native specifications in other languages necessarily work. And I think not supporting the other primitive types is likely going to cause more headaches long term. And so I think it would be good to just go ahead and support all of the primitive types here. And then let users decide what is correct for their app. And I imagine most will end up using sign types because that's what .NET uses, but it doesn't restrict them to sign types if they have a separate need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
So-
I agree with what you mentioned. So OpenTelemetry spec has no opinion on the primitive types. It is basically giving the freedom for each language to pick whatever makes sense for them.
Okay, if we relax that, I mean, does this mean that we need to relax it to the all exposed, what we expose in .NET 6 too? Or?
I have a different interpretation, so I will explain what my take is. I think number one, in OpenTelemetry spec, it says nothing about what concrete types you're going to pick for each language, because that's a language problem. Like trying to unify that and tell people what they should do is like a suicide. So OpenTelemetry is basically saying you support whatever types that make sense to you, to your customer. So if you look at the OpenTelemetry API spec, we didn't specify which type you're picking. And even for overflow, we're saying each language runtime should handle that. You define what's your behavior. For .NET, I'm thinking the current approach, like we only support the signed integer, is a reasonable balance. And I think having unsigned support at this stage is a little bit risky because there are many cases I find it very hard to explain. And the fact that people using that might cause more trouble.
Then why do we support byte instead of sbyte? I understand your reasoning, but it looks like this is explicitly going based off the CLS compliant spec. It's not going based off of we should be using sign types. It's not going based off of anything else. It looks like the very typical .NET API design mismatch of we're going with CLS compliance and ignoring the other types like sbyte, which is the signed byte, and then the unsigned versions of the other integers.
Yeah, good point.
And every time we do this, it ends up causing headaches and downstream complications for users who are actually using unsigned data.
I agree with you. I actually like from my opinion, I would be curious to see if anyone found byte and int16 helpful. I expect people would use int32 and things after that.
I mean, we can add it later too, right? It's not something we have to decide now. But like, I generally agree with Tanner that in the past, whenever we have dealt with that, I mean, generally speaking, we get away for the API surface to be largely dealing with ints. But as soon as you talk about like large volumes of data and our data types where we had to support it, like SIMD intrinsics and other stuff, we just didn't get away with not supporting them. And I don't know enough about your space, but it seems, at least to me, that anything telemetry related is kind of bound to run into large data eventually. And then eventually you may find yourself in a world where you want to support, unsigned data types. But yeah, I mean, it's totally reasonable to say we throw now and we can add support later. I mean, there's nothing really preventing us
Yeah.
from doing that.
Yeah, I at least like for now, I treat unsigned as something that if people use that, they might run into more troubles. So I wouldn't recommend that we have that in the first place. We might learn something in the future, but so far I haven't seen anything related to that.
Then should byte be changed to sbyte or dropped entirely?
Yeah, as Riley said, that the byte is unlikely. I mean, like most of the, I mean, like is not popular scenarios that people is going to use the byte in general. So having sbyte or having byte, it's not that much concern here, I believe.
Like my view here is basically that if we're saying that unsigned types cause problems, then byte is incorrect here, and it should be sbyte. If we're saying that byte and int16 are unlikely because they're likely to never be used, then I'd expect this to be just int32, int64, and then the floating point types. But as it is in the proposed spec right now, we are supporting just the CLS compliant type. So we're not going based off of signed versus unsigned is good. We're not going based off of certain sizes aren't necessary or anything like that. We're basically just arbitrarily restricting it to what .NET thinks is a compliant type specification, which in practice has proved to be incorrect. And so I'd expect one of like 3 different changes here. Either we support all types, we don't support byte, we support sbyte instead, or we don't support byte and int16 because we say int32 and above is the expected
Is there
usage
enough
set.
value there to overcome the fact that the other ones have this constraint?
Yeah, I mean, really, the answer for this is it needs to match whatever we've done on the other types. If we think that we need to discuss fixing the other types, that's a different problem.
I think that's fair. That's probably a pragmatic choice. I think practically, I think byte I would probably drop, because to me byte without an erase is actually not that useful. Like individual bytes are almost never used anywhere of our APIs. There's very few cases where that makes sense. So I think, yeah, if you want to have it simple and only support signed types, to me it makes sense to say you go in 16 and up, and then, you know, floats and doubles and decimal, and then call it good. But if you already support byte on the other one, then that ship has sailed.
Yeah, I agree. So in addition, I think even for 16, like 16, we don't really need that. The internal, like when we have the SDK listening on this callback, internally we take a like much bigger integer, because even if you have the 16 bits reported continuously, if you add them up, they would eventually overflow. And because like in most of the cases, I expect the metrics API to be called frequently. I think 16 is having a high chance of overflow multiple times during a short period of time. So if you want to remove byte, I think it's totally fine with me. I would suggest that we remove the 16 bits as well, because that doesn't sound like a big difference comparing to byte.
I think the other thing to consider is that these aren't just going to be used for I'm only ever incrementing. There's lots of specs out there that have counters that do restrict things to, like, you can't go over 255 because that's the most, that's the actual maximum value. It's used in games, it's used in web APIs and all over the place to track a metric of this is restricted to a byte or a short, either because the underlying type is that or because it's important for performance or memory usage.
That is totally fine. I think in the SDK you have freedom to like configure what's the final storage when you emit that to the backend. So even if you start from 64 bits, later you can say like in practice, I never exceed a certain limit, and that doesn't have to be tied to the actual bound of like integer types.
It feels like where the argument I'm hearing is that we prefer the wrapping nature of sign types just to catch problems, but maybe we can be solving that in a different way. I really haven't heard articulated what the goal of this type list is. Like, why would we restrict one thing over another? It's kind of all revolved around this how they wrap. Should overflow be solved by the platform, for instance, and not something that we would just assume users will know what to do when something goes negative?
Well, the one argument I heard was that they want to limit what you can express here so that you have to have less guesswork on the other side, right? Because if you produce the data, you import it or you export it to some sort of storage, then the other side has to know what the type was, right, in order to have sane semantics. And so the more types you support on the ingestion side, the more trouble you have on the I guess
collection side.
Yeah, on the collection side, the more trouble you have on the ingestion side, right? Because now you have to have more choices to consider. But I mean, practically, like, I don't think that's an argument against supporting unsigned types, because that just means you have more, you can use more of your bits. Like, if you know that the numbers are always positive, which for some things, I guess you kind of do know, like number of sessions will never be negative. So then it's just a function of like, okay, how many bits do I need to represent that number, right? And in that sense, it made sense. It makes sense to me to say, hey, we can just say this is an unsigned int and get away with 4 bits.
And it's also not like overflow is complicated to do with unsigned types. Overflow is if the new value is less than the previous value, overflow happened. You are incredibly like, you cannot do a single addition that causes the value to equate A again unless it was 0, and that's not an overflow. Because
only
you end up
types are exported as integer. So there are cases where the types are exported as float or double. That's where we have the negative numbers.
The float can't overflow like that. Float becomes positive infinity or negative infinity, and that is the I have reached maximum value.
Exactly. So imagine like you have like unsigned int 64, and at some point you overflow, that becomes a smaller number. But the backend system always convert that integer to a float number. Then you will have something really weird to deal with.
Yeah, and so that's where APIs have to either take into account that they should be saturating and doing saturating arithmetic, or they need to do a comparison. Is the new value less than the previous value, which means it overflowed because I expect it to be monotonically increasing.
Yeah, exactly. And in OpenTelemetry spec, there's a clear called out thing that the spec doesn't encourage the language runtime to do a check on every single number. So it should rely on the hardware behavior for best efficiency. And this is why I personally would prefer always have signed numbers.
How about this? How about we take this offline? Because I mean, that's kind of a design point, right? Which I don't think we can solve here. But then, is there any more feedback on the API shape? Like, it looks consistent with what you shipped before for counter. So assuming that we got counter right, that seems reasonable to me. I take this intense silence as we don't have any negative feedback on the APIs.
I think so.
Then let me just approve this as is. And, I already have the comment in there about unsupported or, supported types, I guess, depending on your direction. I mean, to echo the earlier point, I think the key thing is be consistent with what you shipped before for counter. That to me is the most important thing. So if counter already supports byte, then it seems reasonable that this also supports byte. It would be weird to have this support less. But if neither supports unsigned types, then it's just an orthogonal feature us to consider doing that or not doing that. But then again, I would probably do it on both sides and not just one side. All right.
Good. Thank you.
Then let's move to the next one. I think this is Jeremy's. If he's still with us.
Yeah, I'm still with you.
Haven't given up on us.
So this is I've had that open for quite a while, but it's a quite frequently what you're looking for when you're doing a path.exists or a file or directory exists is you want to know whether or not something is there at all, not specifically that it is one thing or another. You want to know whether the space is or that path is available to be used or has already been taken up. And doing that means calling both file exists and directory exists to get the right information. That's not very efficient because in both cases, in both the Unix systems and Windows, it's repeating the same call and then filtering the results to whether or not that particular thing that you found was a directory or a file. So it's quite inefficient. And if you're looping through trying to find things that are reasonable for example, if you want to find a new name, which like Visual Studio for a new project or something like that would do, you're wasting a lot of extra effort to go through there twice. Because there are strings and everything being allocated on the native side to go and figure this stuff out. It has to navigate down. There was some mention in here that there's probably like I/O caching that happens at the lowest level, but that would be where it happens. At least I know on the Windows side, nothing caches super high up. It still has to go figure out who that path belongs to figure out what it actually relates to as far as an I/O sector on the disk, right? So it's basically just giving the logical aggregation of those two things.
So in the past, one of the arguments I've heard a lot is that we consider file exists and directory exists both be kind of like mistakes in the sense that you basically, once you use them, you effectively have a race condition in your code now. Where
yes,
if you should just open the file, and if that fails, then the file didn't exist rather than checking before.
Generally speaking, yeah, I mean, I do hate file exists and directory exists for those purposes because they don't really, it doesn't express what's there, and I'm sure Jared would be happy to explain how that's terrible too, but it is what it is, and it is what we have. I wouldn't change the name of this to be what it really is that it existed at some point after you called. But it's still a valid thing to do an initial sniff test on these things when you're making things. What we are missing other APIs to deal with the common patterns where people need to do this, like for temporary files and things like that. There are some other requests that are API requests that are outstanding that need to be navigated through to figure out. Because really, with a lot of cases too, I just can't give me a temporary file with some given pattern, and you do this and make sure that I actually have a file handle, right? There are some API requests there that need to be followed up on.
I mean, we also generally try to not have path do I/O. I mean, I know that we have some members on that do I/O. Sadly, like I think get temp name or whatever, they actually do create a file, right? But this would also be a thing where it fundamentally has to do I/O in order to produce an answer, right?
Sure, and we do have those. There's not a better place to do it. I mean, like as far as the model is concerned, that's what we have, right? So, for the statics, it's file, directory, and path.
Yeah, I know.
So, I mean, there's a lot that I would like to go back to day one and redo, but yeah, this is, and other people were suggesting throwing this on file info, and it doesn't make sense on those. So. It just beats the other patterns. So there's
instead of
yes.
Instead of bool exists, would something such as path dot
is the name in use, and then now you get the pop up of are you sure you want to overwrite it? Granted, what they could have done was just try to save it without overwrite, and if that failed, then pop up the dialog. But is this name in use?
Yeah, I think practically, I mean, I've used exist call before, and they usually are for UX related things like command line tools, for example, or logging, where even if you get it wrong, like nothing really bad happens. And in almost all the cases where my stuff runs, it's not, high volume, so there's not really a race condition. So the race condition thing, I think, is a real problem, but I also think that in many cases it kind of depends on your scenario, right? If you do high throughput IO, then, well, you're probably in trouble no matter what. But in many cases, whether it's high volume or whether it's running interactively, where the risk for
I know that process cannot handle this case. So if the file exists, I'll remove the file and call the process. I expect that might be a race condition, so I have to handle that somewhere else. And this is something cannot be solved by the API because I have the coordination with a different process.
Yeah, sorry. My point was you basically made 2 points, right? One was the race condition, which was your second point, and the first one was about the, there are cases where you want to know whether there was a file or directory. But the example you provided, it sounded like you already knew upfront whether you need a file or not. In which case, I would not call path.exist. I would just call the one that I need, that I know I will need, right? So that's why I said I don't think, at least I can't think of an example where I want to know whether the path exists, but it matters to me whether it was a file or directory. Because, but not because if it would matter to me, then it's one or the other. In which case, I would just call the existing APIs you already have. Do you know what I mean? Like this new API where it's like, oh, it could be anything, and then we tell you what it was. Like that's the thing I just don't think is useful.
The old APIs let you test for a positive, but not a negative, right? And a new API that gives you just the type would also let you test for a negative.
So one scenario I remember, like enumerating the directory, and if it is a file, then you just output some like file metadata. If it's a directory, then you go to the subfolder. But I think in .NET there's another API which allows you to travel a folder by specifying you only want files or you only want directory. Initially when I use this API, I found it very inconvenient because I was coming from Python. In Python, we don't have such thing. Like you got a list of everything, and they will tell you whether this particular thing is a file or directory. But once I got used to it, I'm not seeing any problem.
Right.
There's pretty rich stuff in the enumeration space, and we expanded that quite a bit before I left System.io.
Yeah, and then the YouTube chat mentioned shortcuts. Certainly, path.exists doesn't have to follow a symlink or anything to go ask this was a symlink, but is it ultimately a file or directory? This just gets to ask stat. Yep. Stat returned success, return true. So this is much more efficient if all you care about is this name in use in this scope.
Right.
Yeah. And it does come up, and it's like the place where it's super safe to do it is where you're logging, like Immo was explaining, or if you're another concrete example is like in the creating new things. It's like, oh, here, I'm going to give you a suggested new project name. I'm going to go and look for something that seems to be available, and you're going to just either modify that or whatever. And yeah, sure, it may still fail once you get down to past that point, but you want to have something that at least is not. You want to at least make something of a best effort to begin with to give you something that's probably going to work. Right. So.
Yeah. So that means. Okay, so we're generally okay, I guess, with the API. I've not heard anybody complaining that it's on path, because I don't like it to be on path when it does I/O, but at the same time, I can't think of a better place either. So I think path.exist seems fine. And quite frankly, if you see this API call, I think it's fair to say it seems obvious that it has to do I/O. Because, I mean, you're kind of asking whether the thing is actually in the system, right? So it would have to check. Any other concerns about the API?
It is past a specific thing for file system, or it could be something like FTP or like more.
It's everything in the System.io space outside of like URI is like tended to be actual system paths, so they're not URIs.
Okay, cool.
So this includes other things like, anything that can be in that name in a path namespace, of course, on the local system. So it doesn't mean a file or a directory necessarily. So that's another thing that comes out of this too, is that you may not be able to use the path because it's being used for something else. But
yeah, in chat somebody suggests file exists with a pattern, but that's basically enumeration, right? At that point, you just enumerate and then you check whether you get more than one result or at least one result.
Yeah, we've got plenty of ways to do that with the other APIs, including fast ways too, if you want to use the new enumeration APIs to do rich things.
But that seems also fairly fringe. I mean, I've never had to do that. I mean, usually when patterns are involved, I care about the actual resolved files, not whether there are any.
Yeah.
All right then.
Pretty neat.
It's only been what?
Almost 5 years.
5 years. It's not too bad. We have done worse. All right. Metadata reader get assembly name. Anybody here to represent that? Going. Nobody? Then I think we should skip that. I think there was one more that I didn't see earlier. This one here. Anybody here to represent that?
We lost Aaron, and I don't see Jeremy, so probably not.
All right, then I think we're done for today.
Well, if you give me 2 seconds, I can just ping Jeremy because he's in Discord, like actively talking.
Well, clearly, then he has time.
He just needs a link. Let me send it to him as soon as I find out where the link is.
It's issue 63714, or you can just go to API-review.net.
No, I meant a link to the API review.
Oh, the actual
He doesn't
meeting?
have the meeting. Yeah, he doesn't have a meeting link, which is why he's not in it. He's on YouTube though.
I thought he was our friend, and he doesn't have the meeting invite in his calendar all the time. So disappointed.
I just sent it to him.
Could have also just called him, actually. That would have been faster, probably.
I don't remember how to use Teams. I don't use the fancy features. I just try and use Discord instead.
If you're
Here's
listening
Jeremy.
remotely, please keep in mind that we highly love our products that we produce in this company.
I am here.
Hey, Jeremy, how's it going?
Good. My YouTube stream was really far behind. I thought I had a whole nother issue before we got to here.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the buffering. So you want us to build an analyzer?
Yes. We want to add an analyzer for disabled runtime marshaling because it turns off a lot of features for p-invokes, and part of the reason for adding this API was to move to the source generated marshaling. But there's still some, like, someone might just switch one DLL import API to use source generated marshaling and then put this API on, and then not realize that somewhere else in their tree they have other p-invokes. A great example of this is actually the runtime repo, where we have all the different files that have all the p-invokes in our shared interop tree. And it's kind of hard to know what libraries include which ones just by looking at the source tree.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is to add an analyzer add an analyzer and possibly a fixer for some of the APIs. The analyzer is the more important part. That'll basically point out to the user, oh, you have disabled runtime marshaling, but you're using these features that require runtime marshaling. So you're going to encounter an exception at runtime. This is not going to work.
And when you get the exception, basically as soon as you call and you get a sane exception, or do you get like undefined behavior and the process is dying in spectacular ways?
Okay, you get a marshal directive exception when you call a p-invoke or a delegate that uses one of the features that is unsupported.
Yeah, that seems like the prime example of an analyzer, right? You just effectively move the runtime error to a design time error, which I think is generally desirable.
Yeah, and then so the idea is the first set of cases are the cases that'll fail at runtime. The second set of bullet points are APIs that might have different behavior than what you'd expect, but you might know that. So the idea is put those as a notice level diagnostic or hidden and allow people like the runtime to enable it if they want to use it. If they know that the case of, like, for example, Marshall.sizeOf might be correct for both cases, it might not. Like, for example, if you have a struct that has a bool, it'll have a different value for each. If you have a struct that has a string field, and then you're using manual marshalling to basically make it so that there's a native representation that you're using, the size would be the same. So the idea was the bottom three points are APIs that might not do what you're expecting.
And what would the scope be? Like, basically, when you do it from a method that is calling to the p-invoke or from the p-invoke? No, I mean, you clearly can't do it from the p-invoke, but like, so when would I get the warning for these three? Like, how do you know that they may not work at runtime?
The bottom three you get a warning if you're or not a warning, you get a notice diagnostic if the disable runtime marshalling attribute is applied to your assembly. Because
it's an assembly attribute. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So for those bottom three, it's like you might be doing something wrong. We don't know for sure, so a warning's not the right idea.
Gotcha.
But notice or less. And if we don't want to do the bottom half, that's fine. The top half is the more important part. The bottom half I just figured I'd mention because it's another place where you can kind of get into a weird state.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom half is probably also not complete, right? It's probably like anything that has to do with marshalling might return different results, right?
Yeah, yes, could be other cases, but those ones are the main ones for, like, you get out a value and then you assume that that's correct, but it's a mismatch. So you'd think it's right, but it's not. It's not matching what you're expecting it to match.
Right.
Whereas most other cases, you'll get an exception thrown if it's doing something you don't expect.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to doing those as notices. Just keep in mind that notice is basically right now when you open up a random project of a decent size and you look into your notice tab, it's probably like 5,000 entries already. So you probably may not see them.
Yeah, that my concern with those is more so like if you're using those, it's more so I want, like, when you're scrolling through the code, you see the little dots under the call to Marshall sizeOf, and you're like, huh, what's that? What's going on there? And then you see, make sure you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, presumably the crash is a good indicator for you to start poking around what you're doing, and probably these APIs are reasonably close to the point where bad things are now happening. So
yeah, they should be very close to the failings location.
Yeah, I mean, I think the analyzer seems. I mean, at least the first half seems pretty straightforward, right? You just look at the actual attributes. It's pretty low noise because it seems pretty easy to check those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Anybody else?
Analyzers are good.
What is our test ground for this one? Because normally we do it on the runtime repo, right? But we probably don't use source generation for our own interop, right?
Oh, we totally do. We use it a ton. The reason I marked this as API ready for review today is because I'm in the process of a PR that's currently out in draft to update the generator to use disable runtime marshalling for the reason we proposed disable runtime marshalling, which meant because we're already using it in the runtime, I had to update a ton of the runtime itself to use disable runtime marshalling. And then I was thinking I should have gotten this analyzer approved earlier so I could use it in the runtime.
Yeah, part of our goal for .NET 7 emo is to only use the generator effectively.
Nice. Well, then, usual rules apply. Run it on the runtime repo and tell us how good that works, or how well that works.
Yeah, I may have already fixed the cases where it's going to fire, but close enough.
Right, then I guess, yeah, the only thing we usually decide is like severity and whether that's on by default, right? And we basically said for the first one, this would be, I guess, a warning. And then the second one would be whatever we call the other one. I keep forgetting what we call it, info or...
Yeah, notice, info, something like, yeah, one of those ones. The lower tier that still shows up by default, but won't ever break your build unless you make it more severe. And then, depending on how loud it is, if Steven tells me to make it off by default and let people turn it on, then we can do that.
I think it's IDE suggestion sounds like what he was going for. Just
yes.
Dot.
Yes, that's what I'm going for. IDE suggestion.
And what's the category? I think the category is interop, right? We already have that.
Yeah, so it'd be interoperability.
Interoperability. There's no way I typed this correctly, and of course I didn't. Of course that didn't work. Really? No, it works. All right. Anything else, or is this it?
That's it for this issue.
Okay, then there we go. It's a bit ugly with the quotes, but hey, it is what it is. All right, then I think we're done for today, right? Because the other one, nobody could talk to. Or can you talk to this one? Probably not. All right, then I think we might be done for today. Then I see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.